Okay, so basically then, if we get dropped from this session, if you get dropped, if I get dropped, please remind ourselves that if you don't get back in about 5 minutes or so, you can go ahead and just wait for the information to be posted on our Canvas site. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So basically, I always want to try to remind us why we're doing these particular sessions. One of the reasons that we want to do them is to provide some key information that may have been conveyed to you over the course of the week in the recorded lectures, as well as provide any other new insights that I may have for this material. And also gives you an opportunity to ask live questions if you have them. So we'll be going over what we've done so far this week by way of a summary / overview, and then have an opportunity for some question and answers. I also want to take this opportunity to remind you that you should be going along with the textbook with regard to the chapters, the annotated notes, lecture notes that are provided to you. And also, when you do get a chance to look at the video lectures, please participate in the discussions there, where they're just asking you to show that you are engaging with material in some way, since we're not meeting face-to-face or anything of that nature. Okay, so the other thing I want to cover as well, as you can see, using the chat feature, please send to me to the host that you are present here. If you're not using your official name, please write out your official name so I can make sure I have the right person when I give you some credit points for attending these sessions. All right, I'll try to remind you again a little bit later as well to send me a text or chat using the chat feature that you are present, for those who may show up a little bit later after we start the session. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on then. All right, so what we have been doing this week, we have focused on two chapters. Chapter 14, focusing on William James, and chapter 15, focusing on John Dewey in functionalism. So we'll start off with chapter 14 and talk a little bit about William James. Okay, so William James, sort of considered the father of American psychology to some extent. We want to look at early U.S. psychology in William James. And U.S. psychology, the establishment of U.S. psychology, it can be seen as being divided up into 4 stages. The first stage is referred to as the moral and mental philosophy. Here, when we look at psychology, you also basically going to be looking at theology or religion. So to understand psychology of the day was to understand the theology of that period, to understand the religious themes and things of that nature. So they were somewhat tied together. And the second stage of early U.S. psychology was intellectual philosophy. Here, we start to see psychology separate itself as a separate discipline, but we also see the influence of Scottish common sense. We touched on Scottish common sense previously in a previous lecture. The idea with Scottish common sense was they believe that for a theory to really have any significance whatsoever, it should not fly in the face of common sense. So if it broke the rules of going against our common sense, it was somewhat useless. So you can imagine what their thoughts would have been regarding David Hume's idea or Berkeley's idea of immaterialism, that there's nothing that's real in the world. So the idea of intellectual philosophy was one of the stages there. Then in stage 3, we saw the U.S. Renaissance, where psychology is now seen as an empirical science, and there are an increased focus on individual differences. In the 4th stage, we see functionalism. Here we see the idea of science, the idea of individual differences, and the idea of evolutionary theory sort of come together to help form the school of functionalism. So that sort of sets the stage of where we are in psychology in the United States across those particular stages. Now let's discuss a little bit of William James. Well, first, William James is not the founder of functionalism, but he is a key influencer. Now, oftentimes when you see in the intro textbooks, they really put William James up front and center as the founder of functionalism. That is not actually accurate, okay, or not fully accurate anyway. He did have a significant role in it. So he was a proponent of this idea of pragmatism. And pragmatism, as I've defined it at the bottom here, is an approach that assesses the truth of meaning of theories or beliefs in terms of the success of their practical application. So for pragmatists, if it works, then it's true. And that's an idea that we'll touch on a little bit later as well to go into a little bit more detail. So what we've seen so far, William James is an influencer of functionalism, but not the founder of it. He was a proponent of something that will be key to functionalism, pragmatism. It also should be noted, interestingly enough, that he established a teaching and demonstration lab at Harvard in 1875. That's about 4 years before the establishment of the lab by Wilhelm Wundt. So he had a lab sooner, but his lab was not a real research lab. It was there for teaching and demonstration purposes. The lab that would be started 4 years later by Wilhelm Wundt was something that was going to be actually doing original research. Okay. So the idea of William James as well, he argued against structuralism, because he saw consciousness as this thing that's personal, continuous, flowing, and very functional. We'll have a little bit more on consciousness in a second. But one of the key things that he disagreed with structuralism about was because he believed that consciousness cannot be reduced. We can't break it down into smaller parts, as reductionists would want us to do. So we see here some of the key foundational ideas of William James that can and will lead a little bit later to the establishment of functionalism. So let's look a little bit at his background. So who is this William James who we've heard quite a bit about? Well, first, he was from a very wealthy and famous family. His brother, I believe, was Henry James, a famous American author. So the family was wealthy and also had a certain degree of fame associated with it. Now, William James initially wanted to be an artist, but got resistance from his father. The idea, obviously, if you want to go into the field of artistry or the arts, they're not always going to be assured of making money or being seen as someone of value to some extent. So his father obviously was somewhat resistant to that. So he did not wind up going into art, but he did go into a variety of fields in college. But he could not deal with the demands of chemistry's lab work when he was in chemistry, or the field work when he moved over to biology. So he could not deal with a lot of the strenuous activities that those two fields required. So while in Europe, when he was on travels, he did learn and studied under Hermann von Helmholtz as well as Wilhelm Wundt. So he got some sort of indoctrination and education from that particular arena in Europe that was starting off with the idea of experimental psychology at the time. He had high interest in religion. In fact, at one point he was thinking about going into religious service. He didn't, but he maintained that interest in many of his works after, as he became a great philosopher in America. In his 30s, he had a mental breakdown. A lot of depression was associated with that he maintained for the rest of his life to some extent, minor bouts of depression. But the idea is that he did have some struggles in his life as well. He was dissatisfied with American education, so he did take his children over to Europe for some time to get their education. He never really broke his ties, from my perspective, as I've looked at the research on him, from his father. I think his father even selected his wife that he was going to marry. So William James is a key instrumental figure in American or U.S. psychology. He was the first professor of psychology at an American university, and he introduced to the Americas experimental psychology. So he, not only a philosopher, but a psychologist, a well-read individual, was instrumental in sort of putting psychology on the map here in the United States. And so that's one of the ways in which we remember him. So let's look at some of his psychological views. Okay, first of all, The goal of psychology, per William James, was the study of living people as they adapt to the environment. Now, when we hear, anytime we hear the word adapt, we probably should and do think oftentimes about evolution. And so, yes, he was influenced to some extent by the ideas of evolutionary theory. And of course, as we will see, we saw previously, as we'll see a little bit later as well, the idea of functionalism is also founded in that concept of evolution as well. So the goal of psychology, study of living people as they adapt to their environment. He emphasized also non-rational aspects of human nature. So he focused on things like passion or emotion, the types of things that we saw the Romantics do in the Romantic period a few classes back. So he saw emotions as being relatively important here. So emotions for James resulted from our physiological changes in our body and then associating that with some sort of emotion. So the idea is that, as we'll see a little bit later, when we cry, we are sad because we are crying. So he picked up on the physiological cues to sort of dictate what our emotions would be. Now, some of the other views that William James had dealt with this thing of consciousness. Now, as you know, we can define consciousness roughly as our state of awareness of ourself and our environment. But what William James saw, he saw consciousness as being very important to many things, and one thing in particular, and that is survival. So he saw consciousness as being required for our survival. That's one of its functions. Okay, so consciousness for him was a continuous flowing thing, a stream of consciousness. He saw that any attempt to try to reduce it would distort it. So you can almost imagine, if you would, that consciousness is indeed, let's say, an actual stream in the woods somewhere. And then if you try to do things with that particular stream, you're disrupting the flow of it. And basically by doing so, you are disrupting the idea of what the consciousness actually is. So he saw this thing as a stream, continuous flowing, cannot reduce it because that would distort it, always changing, okay? And that you can select things from that consciousness, okay? Something that is relevant to you. Remember, consciousness is your state of awareness of yourself in your environment. So if there is something that is relevant to you in that environment, you can attend to it, focus on it, choose to select it for further analysis, so to speak. And it may be something that's going to be really important to your survival. So for James, the idea of consciousness was key to our survival. It allowed us to connect to the environment around us so that we could make proper decisions, for example, as to aid us in our survival. So that's one key idea that James promoted for us. Also, he was very interested in the ideas of instincts and habits. He saw behavior as being evolutionary, meaning that our behaviors become sharpened, okay, and sort of hardened to a degree as well, because they allow us to adapt to the environment. Those behaviors which are very adaptive to the environment allows obviously to survive. Again, we see this evolutionary theory bent here as well. So for him, he wanted to look at two things. What about behavior in animals and what about behavior in humans? Well, when he saw behavior in animals, he saw it as being more instinctual. So for animals, they're driven more by instincts, which means that they are less modifiable. Animals do not have the ability to modify their instincts. But for humans, he saw that not as instincts, but as habits, which of course are more modifiable. It may be difficult for us, but we can break a habit. But instincts are going to be more hard-grained in us. So what he saw here is, again, how the behavior can aid us in that adaptation, much more powerful for animals, less so for humans, but it is there by helping us to form habits. Another key view of James was the idea of self, the Jamesian self. Or the self for William James was the totality of the individual, which is material, the material self, the body, one's possessions and family, the social self, social roles, rank as known by others, the spiritual self, self-awareness, the states of consciousness and things of that nature. So he was one of the first to really focus on self from those perspectives, and also one of the first to really become interested in the idea of self-esteem. Self-esteem, that sense of worth we see in ourselves as a person of worth or a person not a person of worth. So the idea is that he opened up that venue to us to a large extent of exploring concepts of the self. So those are some of the key ideas that William James offered to this early field of psychology in America, in the United States. But the key thing, which was fundamental to the establishment that we'll see in the next slide, chapter 15, is his notions of pragmatism. So William James and pragmatism. This was developed in the United States after the Civil War, where we were no longer content merely to reflect European philosophy. You got to realize this. As far as Europeans were concerned, even today, I would basically think they still see the United States as a youngling or a baby in some regards, because we do not have the long history that most European countries have. So here we see in the early stages of our country, in the early development, we were looking for something that was uniquely our own in a way, something that was sort of a new approach to things. So we wanted a new approach for a new and vigorous young nation ourselves. And that approach wound up being pragmatism. Okay, so Jamesian pragmatism was this: any belief, thought, or behavior that increases life's value is worth holding. So any belief, thought, or behavior that increases life's value is worth holding. So a major judgment value here that is talking about something that increases life's value. That's going to be somewhat in the eye of the beholder to some extent. But what we see here is a tool, in a sense, that help us make a determination of the value of something, the practicality and the value of something. So in Jamesian pragmatism, before determining if any given philosophical claim is true, James thought it first necessary to determine the cash value of the claim. The cash value of the claim. So with regard to any theory, we can ask, one, what difference it would make if I believed it? Two, and what consequences it would have for my behavior? Can you guys still hear me okay? I just got a message from my mic that my mic had gone out. Just send me a chat message if you can hear me. All right, good. So I'll keep moving on then. All right, so the idea here is, if it makes no difference, if a theory makes no difference whether or not you believe it or not, and it does not have an impact on your behavior, then as far as they're concerned, the theory is useless and it has no cash value. So thinking about some of the theories that we've heard so far proposed to us in the course. So the notion, for example, of Berkeley's immaterialism, where he proposes that there really isn't any real objects in the world. There may be sensible objects, but not real objects. And the question is, well, does that have an impact on us from the perspective of, does it make a difference whether or not I believe it or not? And does it change or alter my behavior anyway? And for the most part, we'd probably say, no, it doesn't. Therefore, from the perspective of pragmatism, the theory is not very useful to us. Okay, it has no cash value. So from a pragmatist point of view, a theory is true if it works. That's the ultimate determination of success, that it works. So theories ought to be judged then in terms of their success at helping us solve problems. You can sort of see where this obviously would lead directly into the idea of functionalism. Functionalism at this stage in the development of psychology is almost like the ultimate and applied views of psychology. So theories ought to be judged in terms of their success at helping us solve problems. They are the instruments that we use. The instruments that we use. They're a tool to us. And so this is a way in which we can pragmatically assess their value or their worth. I'm going to pause there to see if there's any comments or questions before we move on to the next topic, starting to look at functionalism. Any questions, comments? You can send them via audio or chat. Okay, it doesn't seem to have any questions or concerns there. In a way, someone asked, in other words, was pragmatism of view is that it's only valid if it helps us? In a sense, yes. The idea would be this, is that it can only be something that is useful to us. So it has to be something that has an impact on whether or not it makes a difference if I believe it. So in that regard, it has some sort of personal impact to the individual who's looking at or reviewing this particular theory. And then it either also may have a consequence on your behavior, okay, or change your behavior in some way. So in a way, it's basically saying this. In other words, it's only useful if it has some impact on you, whether or not you believe it, or it changes your behavior in some way. All right, so it's valid only from a pragmatic point of view. Yes, it's valid only if it does something. One of those two things. It makes a difference whether or not I believe it or not. Okay, even if it makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside, if I believe it, then that serves a purpose. Okay, or it changes my behavior in some way that I believe this theory. So in a sense, yes. Okay, but it's going to be sort of like a personal call to whatever that theory is. But obviously someone else can assess it and say it doesn't make a difference for me, so it has no value. Your theory is useless. It might be personally advantageous for you, but not for me objectively. Okay. All right. So that's William James. And so that sets the stage for chapter 15, where we start looking now at John Dewey and functionalism. All right. So in a way, these two chapters are really tied together. William James just sets the stage for understanding where we are in American U.S. psychology and sets the stage for functionalism. All right, so John Dewey and functionalism. So John Dewey, looking at his background, he was an American philosopher, psychologist, and educational reformer whose ideas have been influential in education and social reform. We'll see a lot of his ideas of social reform in some of his theories and some of his approaches. At the University of Michigan, Dewey published his first two books, Psychology, as well as Leibniz's new essays concerning human understanding. And he was very much inspired by the individual we just finished talking about, William James. So he was inspired by the writings of William James. And obviously that makes a big difference as to how the notions of functionalism sort of came about. So Dewey's philosophy, known as experimentalism or instrumentalism, which was his idea, the notion of what he preferred it to be called instrumentalism, largely centered on human experience. So he saw education should be based on the principle of learning through doing, so experiential learning. And during the 1920s, Dewey lectured around the world on educational reform at schools all over the entirety of the world. So we see Dewey not just as a psychologist and someone who sort of started this functionalism, but in many ways he's probably to some extent even more known for his ideas on education and educational reform. And as we've talked about numerous times in this course already, when we talk about things about politics or how people should be educated, those ideas that these philosophers slash psychologists come up with tells us a lot about how it is that they see the world, how it is that they see the world operating and what's important and what is part of our human nature as well. So let's look a little bit at John Dewey's views on education. So education, a social process and a key to life. He really saw the importance of education, so important that he saw education as life itself at some regard. So education was key to the ideas of John Dewey. Okay. He also saw children's characteristics considered to be curious, social, constructive, and expressive, and we don't want to do anything that would dampen those ideas. He truly believed in experiential learning, that you need to learn by doing, by having your hands on stuff, things that were concrete. Education is a process development. It involves directed growth from educators to help people to educate themselves, and understanding that not everyone learns in the same way. So this notion of individual learning styles. Educators are there to modify their environment for learning. The goal of education is application and improving life for all. So if we look at what he saw the goal of education is, the goal of education is to be able to put it to use in some form. And this added one, really social reform thing, is improving life for all. So he saw it as a way to enhance everybody. Okay. So he links these activities to life in the classroom and into the community. So for him, education is not simply about education or educating for a job, but it's also about the community and the social world in which we live as well. So he also saw that we must recognize, this goes along with the idea of individual learning styles as well, must recognize the diversity and innate capacities of the child. So we're not blank slates, and teaching should not be teacher centered. So those were some of the ideas that John Dewey offered up as being key to education. Now, he did have some issues with the way traditional education was being done at the time. But logically, we have to understand, even today, education is the way it is for some logistical reasons. Can anybody have any idea what I mean by that? Why it is that we have 20, 30 students in the classroom? Why is it that education still has been the same way for a long time, even though there are many forces out there to say that probably should change? Any comments on that, anyone? I'll pause it for a second and see if anyone has anything to say about that. No comments? Okay, no comments. Everyone's shy still today. So the idea here is this, that the way he saw traditional education uh, is sort of contrary, in his opinion, to the psychology of learning as he viewed it, with rote learning, just learning material by rote, not necessarily tying it to anything, that it was too teacher and textbook centered. There were a lot of authoritarian in its methods and a very passive approach. And he saw all of these things from his social reformers perspective as well, as leading to selfishness and things which people were so focused on themselves all the time and not the larger picture of society. So he saw that education needed to have more of a philosophical approach, to focus on the student's interest, have it sort of hands-on and a cohesive approach, not to be isolated. So he had some issues with teaching math in a math class. He thought that it could be just as well taught in a cooking class. So not only do you learn some sort of skill and learn some sort of activities, that you can learn math by doing things, by doing other types of things. So this is probably to some extent why he referred to this as instrumentalism. Represents the usefulness of a concept, the theory of explaining and predicting, and to learn practical skills through experience. Now, if we look at the way education is today, universities, colleges, universities are more about well-rounded educations. Community colleges are more about applied education to some extent. And so you see a lot more hands-on in technical and vocational schools, which are probably a lot more experiential learning because of the content and the topics there as well, that are probably more aligned with John Dewey's ideas. So John Dewey's ideas are around to some extent, but it's very difficult because of logistical concerns. We go to school, most people went to schools like I'm going to describe them. You go to school at 8 o'clock. We're talking about, elementary schools, primary schools. You go to school at 8 o'clock. The bell rings. You go to your first class. You do that particular topic. The bell rings. You go to your second class. You do that. The bell rings. You go to your third class, and so on. The idea is, to some extent, those schools were training us to operate in an industrialized society, that we had enough education to go work in factories. We had enough education to follow the rules, to understand that when the bell rings, we go do this. So the idea is that for the time, it was something that was very beneficial to the society at large. So we want to just put that out there, is that to a large extent, it's logistics as well as the need of the times. Logistically, it would be very difficult for a lot of educational systems to be able to teach individual lesson plans to a class of 30 or 40 students because of the way education is somewhat designed. So again, we see the ideals of what we would like to have, and that's why today the best way that we can do it probably is having a low student to teacher ratio, where we can have a lot more individual type of attention. Okay, so let's move on. So let's look now at this thing called American functionalism, and that's what we're talking about here, and it's sort of associated with John Dewey as having started it. So American functionalism, it believed that psychology should focus on the adaptive and purposefulness of mental processes. So again, mental processes, by the way, as to what purpose or what functions it serves. All right. Doing that as opposed to looking at the elements of mental processes, okay, that we saw in the ideas of structuralism. So they were all about the purpose of things, not the things that make up the elements of mental processes. They emphasized the practical nature of psychology. I apologize. I have two cats in here that are about ready to kill me. So I'm going to pause here. I apologize for this. Oh, you have three cats? We beat you by far. Let's see, how many cats do we have now? Not all of them are ours. We have neighbor cats that just show up for whatever reason, okay, and start to stay here. Okay, my apologies for that. Um, uh, Sammy and Morris just got in a fight. Okay, all right, apologies. All right, so they emphasize the practical nature of psychology rather than being a pure science or a theory. So what we're seeing here, a continuation of the ideas that we saw started out by the pragmatism of William James. So they wanted to remove it just from being pure science. They emphasized it had to have some sort of practical nature to it. It had to be able to help us to accomplish something, to be able to do something. It also had an eclectic and inclusive of both subject matter and methods, meaning that it did not bar anything by way of subject matter or methodology. You could use anything. It sort of sounds almost like the idea that we saw previously offered by Firebrand with pluralism, whatever methods work. This is the same basic idea, that we can put together whatever subject matter we want to focus on and whatever methodologies we want to employ. All right. And then also, especially concerned with motivation, the thought to reflect adaptive concerns. again, why are we doing these things? Why do we have these behaviors? Why do we have these mental processes? Because we're motivated to survive, to reproduce, to compete. These things should not be ignored when it comes to looking at the whole of psychology. In functionalism, and American functionalism chose not to ignore it. And then we have the ideographic versus the noetic approach. And here, the ideographic is basically saying they wanted to focus on the individual and what worked to make the individual happy and functional, as opposed to the noetic, where the focus was on just coming up with universal laws of human nature or personality. So here we see major differences, that they were more about the applied nature of psychology and about the openness of using whatever tools seemed to work for whatever question you had for your particular research, for example. And again, finally, the American functionalists looked to William James, one of their own, William James rather than Wundt or Titchener for inspiration. So obviously we can see why it is that William James is often associated with functionalism, because he was, in many regards, their inspiration. American functionalism was inspired by William James. Let me go ahead and read this bottom snippet I have here. So functionalism has roots in both evolutionary thinking and the common sense philosophy of people like Thomas Reid. He's one of the Scots that I referred to earlier. Psychology should focus on practical knowledge that was useful in helping people live well. So this is a continuation of that notion of pragmatism that we discussed previously, all right? So people to live well, okay? And ideographic approach means that it emphasized on the individual. So they wanted to look at the individual and how this helped individuals in their day-to-day. So this is what we see and what we say about American functionalism. And we can see a lot of the influences of many things, evolution, as well as William James, as well as the common sense Scottish philosophy approach, see here as well. All right. So now that we have that, let's look at some of the details a little bit more closely. So functionalism details in Hegel. So officially, the beginning of functionalism is usually dated to 1896 with the publication of psychologist John Dewey's article, The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology. So he was questioning this idea of the reflex arc, where you touch something, you have a stimulus, and then you respond to it automatically. So he had an issue with that, and we'll see why that is as we go through some of this background stuff here. So Dewey's approach was influenced, and before we get to exactly to Dewey's approach, let's talk about some of this influences. Dewey's approach was influenced by Darwinian influence, evolutionary theory, adapting to the environment, focus on the functions they perform, not the structure. So key here is that from the evolutionary perspective of Darwinian influence, it was about the functions, not structuralism that we saw in the school of structuralism. It was about functionality. Evolutionary theory is adapting to the environment, and the focus is on functions. So that was one thing that Dewey focused on. Then we had the pragmatism influence. The pragmatism influence is this: applied to ideas, it have to be understood in terms of tangible effects that their truth would have on the empirical world. So again, it goes back to what the cash value is. Does it have some way to help you succeed in having a problem being resolved, some sort of solution to a problem? So we have Darwinian influence, the pragmatism influence from William James's perspective, and then let's look at Hegel. Hegel's influence. First, let's talk about how can opposed entities be reconciled. So we've been talking about this for a while now, all the way back to chapter 4 with Rene Descartes, where he came up with the idea of dualism, which was one of the first times we heard about mind-body dualism, mind-body. So Hegel was basically asking this question about mind-body and things that have this type of duality here. So first he comes up with this thing called synthesis. Viewed each side of a dichotomy not in opposition to one another, but in a symbiotic relationship with one another. So two sides of a dichotomy are a system in which both are indispensable, both are required or needed. All right. So we have these two things that seemingly are at opposite ends of each other, but they are needed and they depend on each other. The dialectic in action, thought and action. So we have thinking and we have behavior, thought and action, a dichotomy. So in looking at thought and action, there are not two separate things opposed to one another from Hegel's perspective, not two things opposed to one another, but two sides of the same coin. So the way he sees it is this: thought is what we express in action, and action is the expression of thought. I'll let that sit for a bit. Thought is what we express in action, okay? And action is the expression of thought. So what he's seeing here is not two things which are opposed to each other, thought and behavior, not opposed to each other, but tied together. So mind and body, thought or action, mind and body, the mind requires the body for its own expression. So the dialectic is this: a concept contains within itself the seeds of its opposite, and that it can only be understood in relation to that opposite. For example, we understand thin by its relationship to fat. We understand pretty by its relationship to ugly. All right. So looking at the graphic to the side here, we've been talking about these separate ideas for a while now: mind-body dualism, thinking and behavior, mind-body thought action. What we're basically saying here, what he's suggesting, is there's no real differences between them, but only in functions. That's the only difference, what it is that they do. But they depend on each other. They're more integrated than we can imagine. So that's the background that Dewey had for his approach as he wrote this article about the reflex arc concept in psychology. So let's look at it a little bit here. So now for Dewey's view of the reflex arc. He saw the reflex arc concept as being flawed. He saw stimulus response similar to the mind-body relationship. So we must examine the reflex arc in functional terms. He saw that the stimulus and the response are intimately connected with one another and only defined in terms of their reciprocal connections. All right. So the response determines the nature of the stimulus. Now, when I finish this today, you'll probably have to let this sit for a little bit to let it sort of fester or grow a little bit in your mind. But the idea is this: the response determines the nature of the stimulus. For example, you're in your bed late at night, you hear a sound. As you awaken, then you simply go back to sleep. The stimulus is then determined to be not fearful. You hear a sound, you're waking up, then you get up and run away. The stimulus is then determined to be fearful. So in this regard, the nature of the stimulus depends on the response of the organism. So what, in a way, Dewey has done here, he has tied the idea of the function into it. So the stimulus, whether it's fearful or not fearful, it served a certain function to either say not fearful, you can go back to sleep; fearful, you have to do something and get up and run away. So that was his idea that he wanted to add to this simple notion of the stimulus response of the reflex arc, that we cannot divorce ourselves from these types of concepts. That, in essence, was what sort of started in 1896 the notion of functionalism. Okay, so now we see from William James and his pragmatism to John Dewey and his ideas of social reform and education, to his ideas of being influenced by Darwinian influences, by Jamesian pragmatism influences, and then Hegel, and sort of establishing the role and importance of the function of things, that we cannot ignore it, that they are all sort of relevant and rely on each other. So now we have the establishment of functionalism. Now let's look at some of the functionalists, some of the individuals in the early days considered to be part of the functionalist movement, part of the individuals who are part of the schools of functionalism at that time. We have Hugo Munsterberg, okay, who took over the lab at Harvard in 1892 from William James. And he basically has been associated and credited with some very important things that I find important anyway, credited with creating applied psychology. So he, again, think about this. Functionalism is sort of like the seed that established not only forensic psychology, but industrial psychology, IO psychology, and many other applied areas of psychology, because now it's about what psychology does for us to aid us to solve problems from a very pragmatic and practical perspective. So in forensic psychology, it was psychology applied to law enforcement, and also industrial psychology to increase worker productivity, personnel selection, and things of that nature. So it was highly practical uses of psychology, which is fundamental to the idea of functionalism, particularly American functionalism. We have Mary Calkins, studied under James as well as Munsterberg at Harvard, and she developed paired associate learning techniques, which is used extensively later in memory studies. We see it as well. Stanley Hall, who was the president of Clark University, also known for having invited many psychologists, including Sigmund Freud, to a series of lectures at Clark University, which sort of got Sigmund Freud on the map, so to speak. He was a progressive evolutionist, advocated this recapitulation theory in human development, which is the idea that as humans mature, we pass through earlier stages of evolution that we experienced earlier. And then we have Francis Sumner, studied under Hall at Clark University. He was the first African-American to earn a doctorate in psychology. Kenneth Clark, you may be familiar with him, also seen as a functionalist in the early part of the U.S. psychology. He researched the detrimental effects of segregation on both blacks and whites, and proved pivotal in the famous Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling in 1954 that ended institutionalized segregation in the United States. So we see from these functionalists many things that they were involved in, and later become different areas altogether, developing new areas of psychology, for example. So the functionalists, Edward Thorndike, I want to wind up with Thorndike and Baldwin here to sort of tie this next to what we'll be seeing a little bit later. So functionalism valued both evolutionary theory in animal studies as a means of understanding human behavior. So remember, we saw earlier, they were a very strong proponent of an eclectic approach to things, that you could use whatever methodology you wanted to in order to assess questions that you had about things. And so they're very open to doing things in animal studies as well. This leading to the development of comparative psychology. So we have non-human animal studies designed to elucidate and enlighten us when it comes to nature of adaptive behavior, including human behavior. So we could study animals to get some understanding of how we too may evolve and adapt in certain situations. The psychologist very much doing this was Thorndike, Edward Thorndike. He foreshadows both connectionism, which is the neural connections, okay, and behaviorism. We saw earlier about the law of exercise, which he would abandon, but also the law of effect, which basically positively reinforced responses are going to be retained. So Thorndike, which based some of his stuff on Spencer Bain, what we see is that this will later become key components to the work of B.F. Skinner. So Thorndike was not a behaviorist like Watson or Skinner, but was a major influence on the movement of behaviorism as well as comparative psychology. And we'll be talking much more about Thorndike and others in the next chapter as we go to the next unit and focus on behaviorism. The last individual I'll bring up simply because of his connection to sort of like the end of the functionalism movement, so to speak. And this is James Mark Baldwin. He offered the Baldwin effect, the role that organisms play in directing their own evolution through niche construction. For example, using tools. We use tools. Our ancestors used tools, which allowed us to get better food, to be able to kill other animals, to get even richer food, which allowed our brains to grow. So it started a whole thing. And Bob's your uncle, now we're here. But the idea is that the tool use was very important. So this may give an evolutionary advantage to tool users over non-tool users, for example, by doing this activity and passing it on to future generations. So what I want to end up here was this final comment here. Baldwin, James Mark Baldwin, marks a point at which American functionalism began to decline due in many regards to its own success. So it opened up many avenues of study which would later lead to things such as behaviorism. So instead of ending as structuralism did with the death of Titchener, it increasingly became absorbed into other more focused approaches to psychology, such as forensic psychology, IO psychology, okay, and behaviorism. And so it did not really fade away like structuralism did. It just sort of, excuse the pun, evolved somewhat into the other areas of psychology that we see today. Okay. So just as a reminder, we'll be moving into, that's it I have for that. We'll be moving into module 5, which is going to be the last module for our particular course. We have 3 chapters that we'll be covering. Chapter 16 on behaviorism, okay, chapter 17 on cognitive psychology, and then finally wrapping up with chapter 18 on modularity, neuroscience, and embodied cognition. And we'll have a few discussion boards and a couple of other activities that we'll be doing during this module 5 to round out the course. Just to remind you, essay number 5 and number 6 are no longer required. I will be looking over your essays, essay number 4, which is in queue right now, giving you feedback to that, and also just trying to figure out if there's anything that I can help you guys out with when it comes to your essay writing. Most of you have received a lot of comments from me already. Many of you have gone ahead and acted on some of those responses, and I appreciate that. There'll also be some other bonus activities will be available for you guys as we open up this last module 5 as well. Okay, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that as I post it a little bit later today and things of that necessity. All right, so are there any other questions or comments or things of that nature as we wrap things up? Yes, there's no more essays. All right, thank you. You're welcome. Okay, so any other comments or questions?
I do have a question. When you were talking about you left comments on an essay, do that mean that we could submit any?
Yes, what I was going to say this a little bit later, but yes, the idea is that if you've missed an essay here or there, you can submit one. If you want to go ahead and revise something, you can do that as well. Okay?
Okay.
All right.
I mean, I'm actually happy with my scores, but I was just wondering if I could actually resubmit if I had to.
Yeah, I was wondering because you should be happy with your scores. Okay. All right. So are there any other comments or questions you have out there? If not, you guys have a great weekend, and I will talk to you guys later and try not to wind up in any trouble. Don't show up on CNN for anything. Usually if that happens, it's bad news. All right, I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.